Jake had been working the night shift at the local train station for nearly a year. The pay was decent, and he enjoyed the solitude. Most nights were uneventful, with the occasional late-night traveler passing through. The old station had a charm to it, with its creaky wooden benches and antique clock that chimed every hour. But there was something about the station at night that always felt a bit off, as if the shadows held secrets that were better left undiscovered. One night, a particularly foggy evening in late autumn, Jake arrived at work and settled into his usual routine. The station was eerily quiet, the dense fog outside muffling any sounds from the nearby town. Jake flipped through his book, keeping one eye on the clock and the other on the empty platform. Around midnight, the clock chimed 12 times, each chime echoing through the empty station. Jake stretched and stood up, deciding to take a walk along the platform to shake off the creeping sense of unease. As he stepped outside, the cold air bit into his skin, and the fog seemed to swallow the station whole. He walked the length of the platform, peering into the dense mist, but saw nothing unusual. Just as he was about to turn back, he heard a faint, rhythmic clacking sound coming from the tracks. It grew louder, and Jake's heart began to race. The sound was unmistakable, the steady clatter of a train approaching. Jake frowned and checked his schedule. There were no trains due at this hour. He peered into the fog, straining to see any sign of the incoming train, but all he could make out were vague shapes in the mist. The clacking grew louder and louder until suddenly a train emerged from the fog, coming to a halt at the platform with an almost unnatural silence. The train was unlike any Jake had ever seen. It was an old-fashioned steam locomotive, its exterior covered in grime and rust. The windows were dark, and the doors remained closed. Jake approached cautiously, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He felt a cold draft as he neared the train, and a sense of dread settled over him. He hesitated, then knocked on one of the doors. There was no response. He tried another door, and this time it creaked open. Jake stepped back, peering inside. The interior was dimly lit by flickering lanterns, and the air was filled with the musty scent of decay. The seats were empty, but he felt as though he was being watched. Gathering his courage, Jake stepped onto the train. He moved slowly down the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. As he reached the end of the car, he heard a faint whispering. He turned his head, trying to locate the source, but the whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Jake continued through the train, each car more decrepit than the last. The whispers grew louder, and he began to make out fragments of words, pleas for help, cries of anguish. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. He reached the last car and saw a figure standing in the shadows at the far end. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and dark. She wore a tattered dress, and her hair hung in disheveled strands around her face. "Who are you?" Jake managed to ask, his voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she raised a hand and pointed to something behind Jake. He turned slowly, dreading what he might see. The train car was filled with spectral figures, their eyes fixed on him. They were passengers from another time, their faces twisted in expressions of fear and sorrow. Jake felt their pain and despair as if it were his own. He turned back to the woman, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you want?" She stepped closer, her eyes locked onto his. "We are the lost," she said, her voice a haunting echo. "We cannot move on. Help us find peace." Jake felt a surge of empathy for these trapped souls. He nodded, not knowing how he could help but willing to try. "What can I do?" The woman reached out and touched his hand. In an instant, Jake was overwhelmed by visions of the past, horrific train crashes, lives lost, and families shattered. He saw the moments leading up to the accidents, the fear and panic of the passengers, and the aftermath of the tragedies. The visions faded, and Jake found himself back on the platform, the train gone. The fog had lifted, and the first light of dawn was breaking. He felt a weight lift from his shoulders, as if the spirits had finally found some semblance of peace. From that night on, Jake made it his mission to honor the memories of those lost in the train accidents. He researched the history of the station and the tragic events, sharing their stories with anyone who would listen. The station became a place of remembrance, and the whispers of the lost souls faded, their voices finally at rest. But every now and then, on a foggy autumn night, Jake would hear the distant clacking of a ghostly train, a reminder of the night he spent on the midnight watch and the spirits he had helped to find peace.